of talks for the day called Reconfigurations. I'm just sitting in for Gundula, if you're confused by the program. I'm not two people. Gundula just couldn't make it in today, unfortunately. So our first speaker is Nina Eitman, who's professor of musicology at UCLA and special assistant to the dean of the School of Music. She's the author of Sensing Sound, Singing and Listening to Vibrational Practice, which I'm sure a lot of us have read. And she has another book forthcoming called Measuring Race, the Micropolitics of Listening to Vocal Timbre and Vocality in African American Popular Music. She's also co-editor of another forthcoming volume, the Oxford Handbook of Voice Studies. So and today she's talking about George Lewis's opera, Afterward, an opera in accent.
Thanks so much for the introduction. Thank you, David, Heather, and Kay, hi, for the invitation and for treating us all so well. In writing about Afterward, an opera, I'm at a disadvantage. Like so much of George Lewis's work, Afterward is a complex constellation of elements in which all constituents present themselves simultaneously. But to write and to read is to move necessarily from left to right in a linear fashion. I plot the course from A to B, you follow it. We're both equally constrained in the same direction. This is frustrating. The temptation is to respond to aftermath and to the very task of responding to it through the form of a paper with a linguistic constellation, perhaps a scattered display. Like Zadie Smith, whose works about installation artist Sarah Z's work I sampled for this opening introduction. I am an analog person. Born in 1975, I can still be overwhelmed by simultaneity. And even though my object at hand seems to be straightforward, its composer marked it an opera for me, right from the title. Afterwards, creator quickly adds to his description. It's an opera. It's an opera of ideas. Its story shows characters who are growing up as musicians, composers, intellectuals, community organizers, and educators. It's a coming-of-age story. And I start to suspect it's not only its characters that come of age. In an interview, Lewis muses that when he spoke with Alexander Rothy, who wrote the program notes for Afterwards, as well as the conference paper, Lewis muses that another way of thinking about the opera emerged. It's a Bildungsroman, a Bildungsoper. In the same way as Sarah Z's site-specific installation piece, Afterward grows in complexity through interaction with it. To Lewis's list, then, I add, Afterward is a pedagogical program in the form of a riddle, or better yet, a meditative colon, a paradoxical riddle or anecdote used to demonstrate a shortcoming of logical reason. So it was only when reading Smith's words about Z's centrifuge, as I recited them to you a minute ago, that I started to be able to name my challenge in thinking and writing about Afterward. After, I started to ask more open-ended questions, such as, what is the experiment of listening to an opera, or more specifically, to listening to the opera afterward? For me, it's screen time with its video documentation, an evening of extremely dense music and theater, mixed with conversations prior and after, the kindergarten parent calling to yell at me for going to Ojai instead of to a kindergarten event, and even the beautiful drive back to Los Angeles that late evening. When I sat down to write about the opera, it was the combined memory of all of these experiences and relationships that came to mind. I couldn't distill the opera from all those things. For Smith, when confronted with rapidly revolving ideas, the objects and images that make up Sarah Z's centrifuge, it was hard to know which element to separate from the rest. Yet, if you are to write something, you must choose. How does one choose when Afterward is not one of those well-behaved compositions I learned to analyze? How does one choose when Afterward acts as a centrifuge for both memories of Lewis's past work and events simultaneously to the performance? Not even having finished these thoughts, my mind started to want to plot all the different ways the so-called analytical object Afterward could be understood as. This alarmed me. You see, the last time Lewis gave me a task in the form of a qualifying exam question, I ended up working with 14 years after I turned in the response essay. With afterward, then I would say I didn't work on my qualifying exam for 14 years. With afterward, then I chose to take it as Bildung, as the first of the questions was a catalyst for generative inquiry to respond to the question about race, class, and cultural capital Louis had given me nearly a decade and a half ago. A question that I had hoped would help me build tools to write in a responsible and ethical way about voice, from Billie Holiday's voice and Holiday's imitators to opera singers such as Marian Anderson. Premiered in 2015 at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, Afterward is a 2-act opera based on the final chapter of Lewis's 2008 book, A Power Stronger Than Itself, the AACM and American Experimental Music. Rothi, in his excellent analysis of Afterward, describes it as a, quote, pedagogical opera that manifests the genre mobility and self-determination that are at the heart of the AACM, end of quote. The opera portrays encounters between AACM members as the organization is formed, and a fictional meeting wherein living and deceased members discuss the organization's history and their hopes for their future. Lewis, who also wrote the libretto, built the dialogue for meeting transcripts, but the characters functions as what he calls avatars, each assembled from multiple real-life AACM members. The avatars muse about how all their projects, including composers playing, producing concerts, forwarding an aesthetic program, and community education and organizing, were designed to create a structure for co-creation. My interaction with Afterward have been as an audience member, watching the video documentation of the premiere and experiencing the West Coast premiere. In June 2017, taking in the opera from the Uplawn in Ohio and continuing to think about it during the time that has passed since, I'm trying, as I described earlier, to find different places from within the composition to experience and to be educated and to receive my Bildung. Whereas in some compositions and with some composers, I have this sense that it's one right thing that is asked to be deciphered. With this work, my sense as an audience member is that there is an invitation to find my own way through the, I'm quoting Smith here, complex constellation of elements. So remember, Smith wanted to respond to centrifuge with the linguistic constellation, a scattered display. Her essay features on a spread poor image of the installation on one side, on the left side, and this word constellation on the right side. Smith's constellation is a response to her lack of interest in, quote, plotting a course from A to B. And here's my constellation of impressions. So a kaleidoscopic view reflects the impression of position on meaning making. Just as movement causes a kaleidoscope to reflect light differently, the ability to define Afterward or any artwork depends on the positionality of the person who interacts with it. Thus, meaning and structure are not statically connected to one object and an object or intermaterial moment or node to hold one meaning. However, at the same time, it's not void of meaning, nor is it a situation where any meaning can be attached to any element. Where any meaning can be attached to any element. What is its stabilizing and leveling force is that it is an example of an always already shifting and mutually redefining relationship. So my takeaway is that the simultaneous reflection on opera and on voice may redefine and deepen understanding of each parties. Taking my cue for Afterward, I applied insight that opera can both redefine the relationships between these elements and illuminate new relationships, past and present. And through that process, the person engaging can possibly stumble upon what Lewis dubs accidental meaning making, in my case specifically in regards to theorizing voice. So, Louis' initial qualifying exam question was about the presence and insertion of ideology in the traditional notion of timbre as a general construct. And I was to discuss the ways in which the implications of such presence and assertion would affect my revised conception of timbre. So here, George, I present my revised and updated answer. Before I move on, I should be transparent and note that I worked simultaneously on these questions, and that Afterward sets an example, has really kind of helped me gel my thinking for the ways in which knowledge from different spheres help build this way of thinking about voice. So grappling with afterward also helped me move forward my thinking of how my way of thinking about voice could be laid back onto opera analysis and criticism. So back to my answer, George. The traditional notion of vocal timbre is the general construct. There is no one unified or stable voice. The consequence of this can be summarized into three interrelated correctives that better capture what voice is, I think, and what we actually identify when we identify voice. So, voice is not singular, it is collective. Voice is not innate, it's culture or cultural. Voice's source is not the singer, it's the listener. Taking these three correctives one at a time, we have first, voice is not singular, it's collective. The voice is not a distinct entity, but rather part of a continuous material field. The so-called physical individual voice then is part of a continuum, a concentration of energy that we interpret and define as a distinct voice. The voice is composed of a collection of bodily organs involved in the production of sound, the acoustical conditions in which it is emitted and sensed, and the style and technique involved in its lifetime of training, what Farah Griffin calls cultural style. No one part of this collection of styles and techniques involve race essentially or entails the uniqueness of the speaker. It is rather a performance of cultural style. James Baldwin observes that the collection of performance of race, thusly, quote, I began to suspect that white people did not act as they did because they were white, but for some other reason. That is, Baldwin's insight is that whiteness is a particular performance of culture. The performance of whiteness is followed by the assumption that any such traits are either expressions or false performances of essence. It is this deep-seated belief that is expressed in the observation that, and I'm quoting here, Ralph Nader, Obama talks white. In the absence of underlying assumptions regarding the performed sound of whiteness and which bodies have the right to perform such sonorities, there would be no reason to make such a point. There would be no reason to point out that Obama looks white if we thought he was allowed to make those sounds. Because the voice is not distinct and separate, it possesses neither the capacity to signal innate and unmediated qualities, nor a stable identity. Moreover, voice is not unique, in part because it's not a static organ. It is not an isolated and distinct entity. Instead, it is shaped by the overall physical environment of the body, the nutrition to which it has access or of which it is deprived, and the fresh air it enjoys or the harmful particle it inhales. It is the physical body and vocal apparatus that are trained and entrained each time a voice voices and that develop accordingly. Vocal tissue, mass, musculature, and ligaments renew and are entrained in the same way as the rest of our bodies. Research shows that the body is a result of its overall environment also applies to the part of the body that is the voice. Because we often focus on the sound and assume that there is an unchanging relationship between the entity we believe to be static, distinct human, and the vocal sound we hear, we assume that the voice is intrinsic and unchangeable. However, just as the body possesses different qualities or is able to carry out different activities, depending on how it has been nurtured and conditioned, so too is the voice an overall continuation and expression of the environment in which it participates. The second corrective is that voice is not innate, it's culture or cultural. Vocal choices are based on the vocalizer's position within the collective rather than arising solely as individual expression. Vocal communities share an invisible and often unconscious and inexplicable synchronicity of vocal movements and vocal performance, gravitationally attracted by the dynamics of culture in which the vocalizer participates. This takes place, for example, through the vocal body's movements, habituation of practice, proprioception for self-monitoring, listening, and the specific practices adapted to and expressing a given culture's and ideology's ideals. Neither speaker nor singer use the entire range of their voice's infinite timbral potentialities. In other words, the decisive factor in honing each voice's potentiality and developing expertise in a timbral area is not individual preference, but collective pressure and affirmation. With the multitude of timbral choices involved in learning how to use the voice, voices tend to be developed based on collective rather than single preferences. The process that determines which select areas of our vocal potential we attend to and therefore will be understood as innate is a social one. What we conceive as a singular voice, then, is the manifestation of a given culture's understanding of the vocalizer and his or her role within that culture. That is, vocal timbre is a manifestation of a shared vocal practice. And the third corrective is, as we've already begun to see, that voice does not solely arise from the vocalizer. It's created just as much within the process of listening, and I include self-listening, listening to one's own vocalization here. This means that voices heard are ultimately identified, recognized, and named by listeners at large. In hearing a voice, one also brings forth a series of assumptions about the nature of voice. Identifying the voice as located within the listener returns us to the two first correctives. Because the human vocalizer exists and vocalizes within the culture, within the community, listeners' assessments directly affect and train the vocalizer's materially and sonically, and direct the vocalizer's auto-listening. The assumptions, expectations, and conventions of a given culture and that culture's impression of who the vocalizer is are overlaid onto its acceptance or rejection of the vocalizer, akin to what Marcel Mauss described as bodily techniques. Furthermore, Michel Foucault has noted in reference to different cultural circumstances adapting those listening practices and self-monitoring the voice is the condition of participating in the culture. As he indicates, monitoring is relocated within the individual and does not need to be reinforced on a higher level in the structures of power. In a nutshell, this tripartite cycle explains why, by asking the acousmatic question, the listener cycles between the vocal apparatus as part of a continuous material field and vocal acts that accord with the values and dynamics of the culture within which they are practiced and heard. And ultimately, it is why we cannot expect to yield a single and unambiguous answer to what I've called the acousmatic question. So when it comes to voice, then we ask and respond to the acousmatic question, which I've referred to now 2 times, not only when we separate it from the sonic source, from the sound source, so that's typically when we use that term, but what I want to point out is that I think we ask it all the time. Even when you see me speaking now, you ask, who is this? And this is a question we ask in situations when we don't see anybody and when we see somebody. So who is this? It's a foreign woman. However, listening then, it's somebody tired, it's somebody speaking with a public voice, etc. So however, listening then is a tool that can be used not only to naturalize but also to denaturalize. So I've formulated these steps in relation to the ways in which the acousmatic question is approached and answered, and the ways in which the answer was assembled. So, Formula A describes solipsistic listening, wherein the listener is limited. So these are different ways we can listen, right? Wherein the listener is limited to naming herself as a phenomenon in the world. While we might assume that the object refers to someone other than oneself, in this response to the acousmatic question, the answer always points to the listener. The O is object, an imaginary limited other, purely defined by, the 0 is object, an imaginary other, limited other, purely defined by listener's availability to a priori. This other is also defined by its perceived difference from the subject. Asking the acousmatic question, who is this? Who is this other? Formula B describes a situation in which singer and listener are catapulted into third position, realizing that neither is subject and neither is object. When able to sense the voice as style and technique, a listener must take in the voice as the other as subject. At the same time, the listener recognizes that his taking in is also a subject position. The existence of 2 subjects create a third position, the infinity of all positions, which leads us to the erasure of self and to the recognition of you and of all possibilities and multiplicities. So this leads us to a third formula. From the perspective of Formula C, we consider no one position more important than any other. Indeed, we understand any particular position as the result of a choice based on many possibilities. In the thick event and in the potentiality of styles and techniques, framing and naming point only to these sets of particularities. and in doing so, they point equally to all others. To flesh out explanation of these formulas, let me consider Billie Holiday. According to Formula A, listening stance A, my listening is constrained within the limits of my own symbolic world. I can only hear Holiday through the images I've already formed about women, about African Americans, about holidays as an icon, and so on. These are images existing in the world. In other words, the listener is tasked with comparing what he or she hears within a pre-formulated set of a prioris. Within this dynamic, a given voice is either the essence of an a priori, Billie Holiday as the iconic Billie Holiday as a black voice, or an imitation of this essence. Billie Holiday not fulfilling those imagined images of her. So, for example, Billie Holiday not singing as we expect her to do, or Angelina Jordan's imitation of Holiday. So let's just hear that. So this is when we are trying to compare these a prioris, and we're finding they're not aligned. Or to somebody who, quote unquote, doesn't sound black. This type of listening doesn't grant the singer agency. The singer simply fulfills or does not fulfill the listener's a priori, which has been collected as a result of a specific set of circumstances. So according to Formula B, or listening stance B, the listener's listening is expanded to release his or her symbolic referential frame and acknowledge that voices are the results of style, technique, and conditions. Within this approach, Holiday sounding like the iconic Holiday, or Holiday on an off day with a bad cold, and Jordan's imitation are understood as performances based on style and technique, the voice doing different physical things. The listener's ability to experience the singer as separate from him or herself as a person with agency executing technique and style releases the singer from the listener. The singer is granted an independent existence and agency. That is, Holiday as an iconic singer exists because style and technique are explicitly executed. Holiday with a bad cold exists because her throat is sore and maybe she lacks sleep, and this has modified her technique. And Jordan's imitation exists because she was able to decipher and execute vocal patterns. Here, there is a clear separation between the I and the you, and both combine to that third position. So this voice is not 50% I and 50% you. Instead, it exists within an unrepeatable constellation of circumstances. Considering the same example from the opposite view, we cannot access the totality of the figure of Billie Holiday through any particular reading, but the partial understanding may be accessed through attention to momentary techniques. When listening from this position, we do not hear the complete, in quotation mark, Holiday, or Holiday's essence, but rather the specific sound of a person who is bending notes while forcing sound across a sore throat, for instance. Jordan's imitation is unique in the same way. Jordan is recognized as Holiday not because she is channeling Holiday. Oh, here are some quotes here. Yeah. Which was the language used to describe her performance, but because she applies vocal technique and stylings that lead to vocal sounds similar to those created by the person Billie Holiday. So rather than lauding Jordan for her passive imitation, listeners' recognition of Jordan's execution could be based in her ability to perform vocal choices. These recognitions would then deem her presence, Jordan performing a particular style and technique, and would return it to the foreground of our attention. So, in the third formula C, the third formula C expresses the idea that if a voice may be understood as holding two positions involving style and technique, it could also hold an infinite number of other positions. Sorry. Okay. But when a collection of style and techniques is distinguishable through one name, it may also be distinguishable through another name, and another, and another, and yet another. Given these infinity of possibilities, any assumption about one distinction's correctness are already erased. According to this formula, we can recognize Billie Holiday's style and technique, and these can be heard as patterns that we already know by names such as, so basically what we're hearing are really patterns, and we have come to, people have called those patterns various things. Okay, I'm just going to scroll through here. I mean, you have this in the back of your mind. So battered woman, hypersexual victim, consciousness of a nation, but these are really styles and techniques throughout doing certain things. So when we name those patterns, we name the pattern and not and our recognition of those patterns, but not holiday, and we do not describe her essence. Moreover, within the third formula, the concept of me as a separate identity and the recognition that there is something that is not me coexists. The fact is something that is not me or you, yet it includes both of us, and each of us is only one formulation of infinite possibilities. At this point, then, there is no way to separate me from you without severing the relationship, because each voice has infinite potentiality. Any given materialization holds no more power than the infinite number of other possibilities. In other words, Holiday's instrumentalization of certain sets of styles and techniques do not define her any more than any other existing infinite number of styles and techniques she could have chosen to carry out. It points only to infinity. That said, my goal is not simply to enable us to grasp people's complexity and add more and more identities to those we already have perceived and named. It's here that the idea of afterwards showing me analysis as a koan, as a pause, comes in. The koan actually occurs in the formula above, but only as in a detail. When two objects act simultaneously as interrelated, neither is the subject or the object within that relationship. Here, neither is identified as the namer of the other. It is this and this and this and this and this. We just consider the listener vis-a-vis the singer and the singer vis-a-vis the listener. To assign a definition of a listener or a singer, then we needed to use one of the two elements as subject and as the head of the frame of the reference, thus reducing the second element to object. One element then has some hierarchical relationship to the other, and the definition of the two elements become the manifestation of that hierarchy. In short, what I call the cult of fidelity, the assumption about fixity and knowability of sound lends itself to relationships that are only relationships because of the defined hierarchy between X and Y. Understanding afterward as a koan, rather than purporting to a correct response, suggests a non-hierarchical relationship. Becoming a stranger among sounds is how Josh Kuhn describes this. Being a stranger among sounds happens when we remove the hierarchy between X and Y, the idea that one element is more important or relevant than the other. By retaining the interconnectedness, we create a logical conjunction. The logical conjunction is a statement A, B is true if A and B are both true, else it is false and produces a non-referential relationship among rather than between. That is, two things share a relationship without one of them determining the relationship. All of these namings are in connection, are related, but this relationship and each expression of it isn't a linear one of cause and effect, time and space, before and after. It is a relationship that is manifest through realization of the fact of the relationship. In this formulation, we would expect our formula to show a pause created by the conjunction of formula A and formula B. In the conjunction, we see that formulas A and B are not in opposition to each other. Instead, the conjunction spells out that that 1 is 1 plus 0, and that each 0 is 0 plus 1, and includes any possible combination of 1s and 0s. Each point contains the binary. Moreover, through the conjunction, we move to formula C, where no one single point overrides the other. Because we're translating from a linear subject-object-based discourse, the process of arriving at the response is expressed as as 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 infinity. However, this does not mean that we are only talking about the infinite collection of a variety of namings and identities. This is a woman. Who is this? This is a woman, a mother, a daughter, a friend, a scholar, a runner, and singer, and. But that discourse, writing, as Smith lamented, is always partial in its perspective, fumbles in this inadequate way towards grasping the inexpressible whole. While we might be reliant on such methods and partial perspectives, I feel encouraged by engaging works by Lewis and other AAM members, such as Bodadali and Smith in general, and afterward in particular, I am moving toward ways that retain rather than reduce the inherent challenge of engaging with the world. Thus, engaging afterwards listening methodologies has helped me see ways to denaturalize listening. So to return to Zadie Smith's words, I have tried to figure out a way to deal with the complex constellation of elements in which all constituents present themselves simultaneously. That is the cultural and ideological manifestation of vocal timbre. When I started to write this talk, I find myself not being able to think about afterward without also thinking about other writing and music by Lewis and the whole scene of taking in the opera last summer. I tried to push its simultaneity away. I tried to unremember all the generative questions and conversations we'd had, because they were not in the opera itself. I tried to unremember the friends I shared an evening with. I tried to unremember that I was excited to be at the event with a long-time interlocutor who was now with our friends, my departmental colleague, Shauna Redman. And I tried to unremember that my son, Nicolas, lost his first tooth when the last note of the opera was ringing at the Libby Bowl. However, Zadie Smith's piece of Sarah Z does not speak of it, discovering that Smith and Z are friends who interact beyond the journalistic interview and studio visit helped me realize that all of my readings of work is set within a rich constellation that needn't be suppressed. So Smith's lines about Z and her artwork was written not only about the extremely acute observer of life, culture, and society, but somebody with a rich personal relationship to the installation's creator, at least some of which I will guess came into play when the review essay was written. It was when I stopped worrying about giving one correct account of afterward that I allowed myself to engage it as a meditation piece. It was then it became a koan, which I told you, which in turn served as a key to the puzzle Lewis offered me some 14 years ago. As a koan without any one right answer, it allowed me to discover and create relationships between events that were previously believed to be unrelated or related only implicitly, or perhaps an instance of accidental meaning-making. That is, while the opera's avatars projected multiple people and positions, to me, the opera, afterward, as a whole, also functioned as an avatar. When I listened, I heard not only the so-called present composition, but also my memories of the composer's past compositions, performances, publications, and conversations. The experiment of listening to opera, then, is to hear both the past and present rising. Thus, to me, afterward is about the promise of community and community members' possible futurities as imagined through an opera of ideas. As an opera of ideas, rather than an opera as an unmovable uppercase W work, Lewis offers up a complex constellation of elements where newly defined relationships, codependent meanings, the logical conjunction, are what gives rise to experimentation and potential for surprise discoveries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. Any questions, comments, responses?
Good.
I wonder, well, I guess two sort of questions. The kind of simple one is just a kind of informational question, is if you just have any thoughts about, if your way of thinking about the voice is meant to have, does it have a productive relationship with the actual treatment of the voice in afterward, or just because you didn't talk about the treatment of the voice within the opera, is it more kind of abstract way of thinking about sort of social relations. Is there anything that you want to say about the treatment of the voice in the opera? And the kind of larger question is, I guess, I just wonder how you would kind of position your own approach to the voice within opera studies and Deutsche what you want to do precisely, but it seems to me that because you make this set of correctives, right, and they are very much correctives, I think, to how we think about the voice, and I think part of the attraction, the kind of draw of opera, we've been talking about how artists, for instance, look back to opera, kind of conjure lost opera. It seems like part of what they mean often is the voice as connected to a certain idea of subjectivity and a certain idea of the expression of emotion, and that is very much kind of based on voice having a kind of organic relationship to the self. These kind of old sort of cliched notions, right? That are thinking about or kind of cliched, I guess, responses to opera, kind of based on that understanding, and then on an understanding of a kind of frisson that when that doesn't happen, right, or when that becomes more complicated, that often in opera there are ways in which the voice does seem to kind of occupy this more sort of middle position that you talk about, but it's often meant to be kind of troubling, I think. For instance, the way you talk about the girl singing like Billie Holiday, people are kind of disturbed by this, and some of the quotes are things like, well, she doesn't have the kind of experience of emotion that could produce this, right? We think that voices somehow have some kind of organic relationship to experience, and then there's a kind of frisson that happens when that doesn't appear to be the case. So would you want to kind of get rid of that kind of tension, or are you kind of wanting to think about the voice as kind of more mutually and kind of joyfully in kind of constant circulation, if that makes sense? There's always a middle place between us.
Well, okay. I haven't seen the score afterward, but I heard it, as I told you, and the vocal lines seem extremely difficult to sing for the singers. It's beautiful, it's very expansive, it's very and heroic on the part of the singers, I think. I'm avoiding to talk. I was going to give it an adjective, and I'm stopping myself because receiving that exam question, it's a kind of fun thing to have in a talk where I wrote it. I thought maybe George would be here, or maybe not. I didn't know. So it's a fun thing, right? But it's also a true thing that this moment and paper, just personally for me, is probably not the punctum, I hope not, but it feels like an end point of that question really that I was asked, and I have been grappling with my work just more generally on voice and sound, was to try to build some sets of tools really to be able to speak about Billie Holiday's voice. And when I found that I built those tools, the tools were not to speak about her voice, was not to describe her voice. I think the description is just always going to be so partial. It's going to be this one moment in time, and then you're not going to share that moment in time. So I'm just reporting on something, and very momentarily. So I've been unwriting myself into not wanting to describe voice anymore. That's my answer, I guess. And that led me to this writerly crisis, which is, what do you do then? Like, where is my meat and bread? Where is my, what's the expression? Where is my bread and butter if I can't talk about the thing I am here to talk about, right? Or I'm employed to talk about. So it was very hard to write this paper. Like, it just kind of happened before then. I have all these pages and thousands of words of descriptions of the opera and writing about the opera as I kind of know that we could describe it, or I thought would be interesting to describe it. But I erased it, or I put it in a file, do not open file, because I don't believe in it. But then the other thing that I don't believe in, it's not just the description of the voice, and I don't fault anybody for describing it. I mean, I do still do a described voice, but I don't know if I want to sign my name under those descriptions anymore. I want it to be in the moment, right? And probably next year I will, because I need to show something to UCLA again, you know. But but the other point, you know, returns then to me, like who it's as much who one is as a writer, the kind of voice. And now I'm talking metaphorically. I mean, my whole time trying to not speak metaphorically about voice, but now as a writer, what kind of voice am I speaking from? So all the work I've done on voice now I've been trying to be very careful to say, I'm not talking as a singer. I am not talking as a neuroscientist. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm talking from the point of view of what a neuroscientist would say about it. I'm not talking as what the otolaryngologist would say, like very specific in my position to what I'm saying. And I feel like now I'm at the point that maybe I can't even do that anymore. So then writing this essay was very hard because I didn't know what voice I was writing with. So that's why I started by sampling, because I thought if I could use somebody else's voice, then I'm showing very clearly that my voice is not my voice. So at this point I'm at the place where I say, like I'm saying here, our voices are not our own. When we speak, the words I speak, I've learned to speak those words with George, through my education, they're not mine. None of our voices, I think, and things we say and think even are ours. It's part of this collective that we are enmeshed with it. So what I'm doing now, kind of to answer what do we do then, is to to write about the things between. So the question I'm working with now is, why is it different to sing together versus singing alone? Why if we sing the same song every night together with a child or a mother or a father, is that different if we sang that song alone every night? Or why is it different when we sing together in choruses or in a march now? Why is that experience different from alone? So it's still working with like the definition of the work, I guess. And then I'm very interested in proportions, because I think proportion. So that's I was trying in this essay, like more abstractly. I was trying to show the proportion between voices, so that one voice you can only recognize one thing, I believe now at this point, by seeing the other thing that it is in relationship to. So I don't know the dimension of something before I can compare it to something else, and that's really what Leo Smith's work has shown me. His composition of the plates, and afterward has shown me that is in this, when we have the ability to see things through their proportions. I think that's the only thing I can talk about now. Our voices in proportionality to one another.
Just to reiterate, I think what I find so fascinating about what you're saying in part is this way that you have of reflecting that idea of our voices not being our own as a positive thing. And I think in so many cases that's experienced as or something like that is experienced as troubling romantic.
I don't know if it's positive or negative. I'm not setting a value to it. I'm just describing a situation. Yeah.
David.
Thank you. That was fascinating. And I'm trying to think exactly how to ask this question. I mean, first of all, your explanation right now is greatly illuminating, I think, on the paper, especially to see, I don't know if this is correct, but I'm now understanding your paper as a kind of almost like crisis of representation in your own use of language. And I guess what I'm wondering about, so you begin with quotation and then you move into logical, like formal logical axioms, and then you mix in a kind of, like memoir or autobiographical thing that's pushing against any sort of academic norms. Not that many people don't use it, so it's using all these modes. And you were saying that you don't know that you believe any longer in your long-standing project of describing voice, or trying, or at least I thought that you said that just now. And I was wondering, is it possible that you don't even believe in, or at least, why do you still believe in voice even as a category of analysis? What, like, the problem that you seem to be describing, or that you seem to be working out, is the impossibility of coherent descriptions in the first place, when you could just have an infinite number of adjectives added onto them. Or, throughout your talk, just because I have very limited knowledge of formal philosophy, what I know basically is Wittgenstein. I kept thinking about Wittgenstein and the problems of definition that he comes to later on the example of the word game or play, spiel, and there being no necessary or sufficient, or at least necessary criteria to define it. And so for me that just seems like a huge problem of any kind of speaking or writing, and I wonder why voice is even still your problem. Like, why is voice the problem rather than almost anything else? I don't know if that makes sense, but like, it almost seems
yeah, I don't think voice is the problem more than anything else.
Yeah.
It's for me. But I don't, yeah. So it's not that I don't believe in voice anymore. It's that I don't find it useful for myself, and I don't speak for anybody else now. So then rather than saying it's this and this and this and this and this and just knowing it's this in this moment of time, that's why I'm saying, that's why I find proportions useful. I need it to be something I need to describe the thing in relationship. I need to know what this, because it's related to this other thing, how they are co-meaning making each other. And that's also why, like you said, I'm starting with quotation, and then I kind of the more, I guess, a large part of that paper are just formulas, because by formulas I'm not pointing to the thing, I'm just pointing to the relations. So I mean, I'm working it out, but what I've said in terms of voice, then I'm interested in why one voice, my voice or your voice, is not the same when you sing with somebody else. So it's that still the problem of voice, but the voice in relation, in proportion to somebody else's voice.
Does voice pose a special problem in this capacity, or does like describing anything pose a similar problem? I guess that's what I'm basically trying to ask.
Well, I think number one, I haven't investigated anything else as much as deeply as voice, so I couldn't tell you. But I think a voice represents a particular kind of version of that problem, because it has been used as a metaphor of subjectivity, as essence, etc., 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 etc. So when we say something about voice, we say something not really about, what I try to do in my work is to say we're really talking about this voice, like the physical voice, but then we're really, when people talk about voice, and when we unravel voice, we're not unraveling this, we're unraveling all these other things.
I want to ask a question about the place, if any, of the body in your thinking about voice. Because as I was watching the clip that you posted of the young girl singing Billie Holiday's repertoire, I thought of a performer whose work I know, whom you may know as well, named Joey Arias.
Yes.
Transgender performer who specializes really in public performances of Billie Holiday's repertoire. And his body is a transgender body. And there's a sense in which if we think about vocal performance, right, which might be a slightly different category than voice implicitly, the hearing of his voice is much a function of a regime of visibilization, right? And watching this body, which is gendered in a non-conforming way, and hearing that voice through the visibilization of this body, hearing Billie's voice through that. So if we try to sit at the intersection of queer theory and opera studies, to what extent do we need a framework for theorizing the question of the voice that also takes account of corporeality, and if we think about performance, of the ways in which vocal performance is always already also situated, not just in an acoustical, but in a visual field, in which bodies are visibilized, and we hear people's bodies as much as we hear their voice.
Yes, we hear with our eyes.
Yeah, we hear with our eyes.
Yes. So exactly. Yeah. So I've worked on. I have a whole chapter on Holiday in the book that now has changed. The publisher changed the name. The Race of Sound is what it's called. In any case. So basically, so it's this problem that we're still kind of maintaining essence of voice, but at the same time recognizes somebody's voice in somebody else. So how can we do that? This seems to not be possible, right? And then, so I use Holiday, but then people who are very different in the corporeal composition from Holiday, because the quotes that you saw about her, and I call them so ways of describing Holiday as autobiographical. Channeling ancestors, like when one might channel one's ancestors, but like descriptions just say like the way she sings, Holiday sings, is because she is channeling ancestors. And then the kind of biological determinism, like the things that happen to her are just the things that she sounds like. So when we see those descriptions and beliefs about Holiday, but then at the same time we see very different kinds of bodies, or hear very different bodies making very similar sounds, and sometimes I play this many times for people with Holiday's image, and then with the video afterwards, and people are fooled. So how can we hold those two things simultaneously when the essence of Holiday's voice with some very different bodies singing her? So you have this little girl who's 7-year-old, you have Aria who's a transgender, you have very trained singers, etc. You have David Sedaris. Yes, exactly, yeah. So what happens, I think, is that there is people want to maintain essence, and I put up this slide here now because the way that it's done is through language. So they say that Holiday, these imitators are they're spooky, and Arias too. He's invoking Holiday's spirit in a way to just say that he has her objects. He has a suitcase, I believe. I haven't seen the performance myself live, but so he has her objects, so it's a kind of way of invoking Holiday and have her materiality, and that's how he's channeling her. But this word and this terminology, channeling, spooky, otherworldly, is invoked because that retains what we say about Holiday still its essence, at the same time as we hear her voice in other bodies. So it's this kind of mental gymnastics. And there's a lot of research that shows how we listen with our eyes. How the example that's easy to use, I always go back to, is teaching assistant lecture recorded by somebody grown up in the United States, speaking American as a mother tongue, American English, then paired with an image of somebody looking like an Asian person, and then somebody looking like a white person. And the first is rated on legibility, intelligence, and the Asian, the voice, the same recording, paired with the Asian-looking picture. Is rated as much lower in all the categories, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then you see, and a lot of my work have done that, trying to show how the actually visual language is overlaid on the sonic, but then it gets so paired that when we hear the sonic, the visual language is evoked. So when you hear somebody on the radio, you might think, oh, that's the Asian person. I don't know what category comes to your mind, but this is a man, this is a woman. Like the image, the visual image, the body, the purpose comes to mind immediately through the songs.
All right, apologies for cutting off any further discussion, but I think we should move on. Thank you very much. Our second speaker in the panel is David Levine. Who is, get your full title, the Addie Clark Harding Professor in the Department of German Studies, Cinema and Media Studies, and the Committee of Theater and Performance Studies at the University of Chicago. He's the founding director of the Gray Center for Arts and Inquiry at Chicago. He was the longtime executive editor, long-suffering executive editor of the Opera Quarterly. He's the author of Richard Wagner, Fritz Lang, and the Nibelungen, and also Unsettling Opera, and finally the editor of Opera Through Other Eyes. David.
Thanks so much. This, although it's not announced as such on your program, would appear to be the superego panel. I began my career as an assistant professor at Columbia, and I taught Lit Hum, Columbia's core course in literature, with great gusto. We had our weekly staff meetings here at the Heyman Center, in fact, at this very table. It's good, if also necessarily a bit unnerving, to be back. I want to thank David Goodkin Armin Schwartz and Heather Reed for putting this event together and for inviting me to participate. And let me also thank Kay and the staff of the Heyman Center for hosting us. Let me begin with a thought experiment. It's not a particularly outlandish one. If this were a conference on experiments in literature today, would it make sense to present a paper on, say, James Joyce's Ulysses? Since an understanding of Joyce's experimental achievements in literary form and expressive heterogeneity would enable us to grasp contemporary experiments. Likewise, if we had gathered to discuss experiments in poetry today, could we imagine a paper on Gertrude Stein that might proceed in the same manner? You see where this is going. For the purposes of our discussion of experiments in opera today, I want to consider Bernd Alois Zimmermann's Die Soldaten, a piece that premiered in Germany after a rather lengthy and complicated gestation in 1965. My sense is that Zimmermann's experimentation in Die Soldaten can help us not only grasp contemporary experiments, but arguably trace their origins. Die Soldaten seems like an excellent test case for this proposition in three distinct but related senses. First off, for dramatic reasons, because the piece famously dispenses with inherited conventions, and by that I mean Aristotelian unities of action, place, and time. But also secondarily because the piece's dramaturgy remains vexing for the historiography of modernist opera, that is, for a conventional protocol by which we have come to recognize and process opera's contemporaneity. And for this, I think Joy Calico's work has been really instructive. If Brecht has tended to serve as the hub through which opera's various journeys into modernist experimentation has conventionally been routed, I wonder whether Zimmermann's piece doesn't follow a rather different dramaturgical itinerary, one that makes its way through Artaud. And finally, it strikes me that we haven't quite come to terms with the utterly extraordinary musical, medial, and scenic demands of Zimmermann's piece, such that the challenges that the piece continues to pose on stage make it very much an ongoing experiment in opera today. Of course, that's a lot to cover in 30 minutes, so I hope you'll allow me to proceed somewhat synecdochally, threading my tripartite argument through a consideration of one particular problematic, namely the spectator's place in Die Soldaten. And I mean that quite simply and quite literally. Where, I want to ask, does Zimmermann locate the spectator in his theater? And why does it matter? In order to answer this question, I propose to undertake a bit of a journey to Bayreuth and Paris, with a pit stop right near the middle, where I'll screen a staging of the prelude to Zimmermann's piece. Before we head off, a brief word about why we're undertaking this particular itinerary. There is, to my mind, a notable tension between, on the one hand, the expressive aspirations of Zimmermann's piece, its commitment to what the composer famously characterized as pluralistic and circular, as kugelgestaltige forms, and, on the other hand, the presentational limits of the opera house. Put most directly, my sense is that Die Soldaten was conceived and written for an opera house that had not been built. And thus, its experimental energies involve reshaping the opera house and repositioning and re-inflecting the spectator. But how so? To answer that, I propose that we consider the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth. And not just because this comes at the end of an epic day where now you're being asked to sit until at least 6 o'clock. The Festspielhaus in Bayreuth, itself famously a theater built to contest and redress the expressive limitations of opera at the time. Among the Festspielhaus's most notable terms of contestation are a number involving the situation of the audience. I'll resume a couple of them. By dimming the lights, locating the auditorium on a raked incline, and insisting upon unrestricted sightlines for all, Wagner sought to situate, and as Jonathan Crary has noted, he sought to discipline his audience in such a way that they would be properly absorbed by stage events, silent, rapt, collectivized, and still. And while many of the innovations that characterized the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth were rapidly adopted in opera houses constructed in its wake, one of, or arguably the most radical of Wagner's innovations went largely uncopied, namely his submersion of the orchestra into a cavern below the downstage thrust. That submersion represented an extraordinary challenge to opera's architecture of distanciation. The fact that between the audience and onstage events was the body of the orchestra, or indeed the bodies of its musicians. Those musicians represented a corporeal and spatial abyss of sorts, a kind of no man's land that separated and in doing so arguably reified the distinction between artists and audience. By relegating the bodies of the instrumentalists to an invisible space below the stage, Wagner not only suppressed the means of instrumental production, but in doing so he sought to suture a gap that kept the audience at a distance from on-stage events. Of course, both of these facts, the disappearance of the laboring instrumentalists and the physical, acoustic, and spectatorial absorption that it served, both of these facts were important to the theoretical underpinnings and practical ambitions of Wagner's artwork of the future. Like any number of modernist pieces before it, Die Soldaten can be understood to militate against some of the central terms of Wagner's legacy, including, first and foremost, the term centrality itself. But like any son of Wagnerism, there is much pro-Wagner in Zimmermann's institutional dramaturgy, as there is anti-Wagner. And certainly Wagner's determination to suture the gap between his audience and onstage events is a legacy that Zimmermann was keen to adopt and adapt. Of course, he did so with very different ends in mind. If Wagner famously sought to gather together and centralize the expressive means at his disposal, marshalling the previously disparate channels of 19th century operatic expression in the service of an overarching purpose, the history of 20th century opera involves any number of experiments that move in the opposite direction. That is, in favor of expressive deconsolidation and dispersion. And when it comes to the aesthetics of deconsolidation and dispersion in the opera house, Zimmermann's work is of obvious importance. An importance signaled by the priority that he accords to the practices of expressive pluralization. Zimmermann was keen on gathering and deploying a radical and unprecedented variety of expressive forms. But he did so in the service of what we can, I think, describe as a centrifugal process, while Wagner's deployment of a variety of expressive forms was centripetal. Put otherwise, while Wagner gathers expressive forms together, draws them in a gesture that we can describe as corporatist or conglomerational, serving an overarching expressive aim, Zimmermann marshals expressive forms in order to disperse them, to strew them about the scenic and aural landscape of his piece. And just to be clear, Zimmermann's manner of deployment is no less intentional and no less controlled, but it produces a very different result. And indeed, and herewith we're getting closer to the crux of my remarks today, I think Zimmermann envisions a very different relationship to his audience. He conceives of and addresses his audience differently, locates them anew. In fact, you know what? I don't want to show you this yet. Hold on a second. In fact, the distinction, I wrote slide, but in fact, the distinction between a centripetal and a centrifugal compositional logic occurs to Zimmermann, albeit in the course of a typically rhapsodic and wonderfully suggestive account of how his work has generated a new conception of the operations of time and space in opera. According to Zimmermann, and this is a claim that he repeats throughout his writings on this piece, his compositional work derives its impetus from a key facet of the source material. Zimmermann's Soldaten, I should remind you, is based upon the play of the same name, The Soldiers, written by the extraordinary 18th century playwright Jakob Michael Reinhold Lenz, J.M.R. Lenz, also the subject of Büchner's amazing short story. For Zimmermann, Lenz's predilection for the unity of the inner dramatic action, that's a kind of buzzword for Zimmermann, the unity of the inner dramatic action, rather than the Aristotelian unities of time, place, and action, is of tremendous and generative importance. It enables both authors, that is Lenz and Zimmermann, to move freely about the cabin of space and time. Let me quote Zimmermann at some length. I gave you a preview there. In order then to explore with you the implications of his claims, not so much for the compositional logic of the piece, but for the radical way in which it rethinks the role and the position of the spectator. Okay, and this is the first of a couple of epic quotations. In fact, okay, so Zimmermann sets out, don't read this yet, sorry. Zimmermann sets out to answer the question that echoes the question that David, Armin, and Heather have posed for this symposium. The question he poses for himself is, what possibilities lie within opera, which is, as a form, so old and so frequently taken for dead? Zimmermann's response is typically dizzying and exhilarating, disorienting and suggestive. A new idea of opera, suspended in midair between a centripetal conception of space and a centrifugal conception of time. A centripetal conception of time and a centrifugal conception of space. What does this mean for the everyday of stage life? To begin with, transferring the spherical conception of the space-time construction of opera to the flat, frontally oriented stage and auditorium of our opera houses. This means that the stage, high and low, would be peripherally surrounded by groups of percussion instruments, which is what Zimmermann's score requires. The acoustical half circle of the stage will be closed to complete a full circle through the installation of groups of speakers in the hall, on the ceiling, and in the background. And the stage and orchestra in the orchestra pit will interact with each other in the center point of this circle, a variegated web of space sound symbols, starting to sound like Sun Ra, isn't it? Of coordinated acoustical phenomena zooming to and fro. Through the ever-changing spatial configuration, the instruments become the perpetually mobile partner of the singer on the stage. The audience is now completely integrated within the musical process in a far more intensive manner than was previously possible when they were positioned frontally in direct opposition to the stage. I want to linger on this formulation because it is, I think, one of the most radical claims formulated by a composer who made a habit of formulating radical claims. And I'm not sure that we've granted sufficient attention either to its specific terms or its expressive and architectural implications. Let's focus then on the concluding line of Zimmermann's claim. The audience is now completely integrated within the musical process in a far more intensive manner than was previously possible when they were positioned frontally in direct opposition to the stage. What Zimmermann has in mind here is the supersession of the proscenium stage and its replacement with a scene that would surround and engulf the spectator. This is an absolutely extraordinary proposition, and one that has proven exceedingly difficult to realize, at least on a conventional proscenium stage, for obvious reasons. But what is at stake in the incorporation of the spectator that Zimmermann envisions here? In an essay that positively overbrims with inspired reveries, Zimmermann eventually returns to it and expands his astonishing thoughts on the spectator in ways that I think are especially instructive. So let me quote a bit more. The listener in the middle of the action, which, determined by a selected dramatic situation, expands and contracts, the development entangling and disentangling itself in various forms, constantly fluctuating between the planar and the circular. The entirety of the musical material of the opera was derived from a symmetrical, all-interval 12-tone row, out of which the constituent proportions for the total work were developed. The listener in the middle of the action, constantly fluctuating between the planar and the circular. The notion that the listener would be smack dab in the middle of the action has developed a powerful appeal in contemporary operatic practice. My hunch is that we'll return to this idea tomorrow, as we've already discussed it with some frequency today, as we discuss with practitioners some of the experiments that they have been undertaking. We already talked about Yuval Sharon's work, and he's, of course, not the only one, to be interested in a sense, transporting the listener in a physical sense as well as an emotional one. But for now, I'd like to offer you a quick glimpse into what this might look like in contemporary practice, or in contemporary practice of Zimmermann's work. In 2012, the Salzburg Festival engaged the Latvian stage director Alvis Hermanis to prepare a production of Die Soldaten, with Ingo Metzmacher conducting the Vienna Philharmonic and Laura Aiken singing the principal role of Marie. I'll spare you a rundown of the cast for that. We have Wikipedia. The production takes place at the Felsenreitschule, the erstwhile stables and weekend equestrian seminary that has been repurposed as a performance space by the festival, although it was originally a performance space as well. I'd like to show you the Prelude and Introduction as envisioned and performed in Salzburg. In fact, there are 3 commercial recordings of Die Soldaten available, and idiomatically they are radically different. So I happen to be choosing this one. We could just as easily have chosen one of the others. Zimmermann's stage directions for the scene we're about to see are super spare. Der Vorhang öffnet sich langsam, die Szene ist noch dunkel. The curtain rises slowly, the scene is still dark. Let's take a look. And I apologize now for the technological snafu that is inevitably going to come. I'm hoping that we might have a chance to discuss Hermanus's account of the Prelude in the Q&A, but for now, suffice it to say that I sense here both the opening up of some of Zimmermann's aspirations and the constraints under which the production operates. I mean this quite literally, which is to say quite spatially. Hermanus activates all sorts of spaces of signification behind the scene, across the horizontal plane. Never before, I think, has the full depth and breadth of the stage of the Felsenreitschule been so emphatically activated as in this production, which seems to extend forever to the sides and to the rear. But the emphatic limits of that gambit are equally clear, for while the stage signifies and signifies multiply on different planes and to different effects, there's that yawning cavern occupied by Ingo Metzmacher and the Vienna Philharmonic that separates the onstage pluralization from the entirely intact disposition of the audience in their plush seats in the auditorium. Thus, in the architectural and institutional politics of the Salzburg production, there is much that is ambitious and properly pluralistic, to speak in Zimmermann's terms, and yet there is much that is resolutely conventional. Of course, the specific terms of Zimmermann's idea of locating the spectator in the middle of the action has important precursors in theater history. And I want to take a few minutes to explore the terms of one particular echo that I perceive and that I'm guessing many of you will have perceived as well. Which takes us to Paris. In the 1930s, Antonin Artaud publishes The Theater and Its Double, a collection of essays that radically and by now famously challenges many of the underpinnings of conventional bourgeois theater. Like so many revolutionaries, Artaud's mode is hectoring, impatient, and strident. And like Zimmermann, Artaud's prose is often fervent, rhapsodic, circular, and highly original. Let me be clear. The association that I'm proposing here involves a conceptual intersection, not a biographical one. As far as I know, Artaud and Zimmermann never met, and while Zimmermann was presumably aware of Artaud's influence, we might term what I'm seeking to describe here as a coincidence of visionary invention. Exploring Zimmermann's relationship to Wagner would make for an interesting dissertation. To think through his relationship to Artaud would take a research cluster. And we have only 4 more minutes. But let me propose a few points of intersection. Among the profusion of astonishing propositions collected in The Theater and Its Double are a number that intersect with the practices enumerated in Zimmermann's writings about die Soldaten. Artaud envisioned replacing the conventional bourgeois theater with something that he cryptically and emphatically dubbed the Theater of Cruelty. The cruelty that he envisioned is not, as he points out repeatedly, a spectacle of violence and blood. Rather, it seeks to capture something of the implacability of man's subjection to forces radically beyond his control. The theater, in Artaud's mind, is the perfect place to render the experience of this implacability, albeit not by conventionally mimetic means. That is, Artaud is committed to a radically contemporary and a profoundly experiential theater practice, one that would challenge the presuppositions of theater in form and in content. How so? Artaud was famously exasperated with, and he sought to dispense entirely with, the priority accorded language and the text in the history of Western theater. In the second manifesto for the Theater of Cruelty, he describes a program of aesthetic disruption via unpredictable expressive dispersion, which sounds a lot like Zimmermann's intentions in Die Soldaten. We must base the theater upon spectacle before everything else, introducing into the spectacle a new notion of space utilized on all possible levels and in all degrees of perspectives in depth and height. And within this notion, a specific idea of time will be added to that of movement. Whereas in the, let's call it, culinary theater of today, the nerves, that is to say, a certain physiological sensitivity, are deliberately left aside, abandoned to the individual anarchy of the spectator. The Theater of Cruelty intends to reassert all the time-tested magical means of capturing the sensibility. These means, which consist of intensities of colors, lights, or sounds, which utilize vibration, tremors, repetition, whether of a musical rhythm or a spoken phrase, special tones or a general diffusion of light, can obtain their full effect only by the use of dissonances. But instead of limiting these dissonances to the orbit of a single sense, we shall cause them to overlap from one sense to the other, from a color to a noise, a word to a light, a fluttering gesture to a flat tonality of sound, etc. So composed and so constructed, the spectacle will be extended by elimination of the stage to the entire hall of the theater, and will scale the walls from the ground up on light catwalks, will physically envelop the spectator and immerse him in a constant bath of light, images, movement, and noises. Artaud's terms here, his determination to address rather than ignore the spectator's nerves, and beyond that their unconscious sensorium, his predilection for multisensory dissonance, and his determination to eliminate the stage and envelop the spectator, these read like they've been lifted wholesale from Artaud and Xeroxed into Zimmermann's playbook. I wanted to work in the New England Patriots here, but I'm going to leave that out. In an article that issues an intense denunciation of the culture of bourgeois theater, Artaud echoes this idea of relocating spectators, moving them from a frontal separation to a wholesale immersion. In the Theater of Cruelty, he writes, the spectator is in the center and the spectacle surrounds him. In this spectacle, I'm still quoting, the sonorization is constant. Sounds, noises, cries are chosen first for their vibratory quality and then for what they represent. Throughout his writings, Artaud envisions a spectacle that engulfs and enraptures the spectator. And in order to realize that dream, he hits upon the idea of replacing his audience, not just in the sense of replacing a bourgeois audience with a new audience attuned to the demands of a radically contemporary theater, but also quite literally, which is to say, quite geographically. He would resituate or replace them. As he puts it elsewhere, in the Theater of Cruelty, I'm quoting again, I'm quoting the quote I just quoted, the spectator is in the center and the spectacle surrounds him. This, in a nutshell, is Zimmermann's thought when it comes to Die Soldaten, der Hörer inmitten eines Geschehens, the listener in the middle of the action. What would it mean for an opera house to dispense with the frontal form of its address? To position its audience not at an assigned, safe, and centralized position of spectatorial and auditory sovereignty, but in a contingent place in the midst of events, unfolding in his or her midst. This is a question that Zimmermann raises with some urgency in Die Soldaten. It's also a question, as I've tried to suggest to you today, that derives from the institutional and architectural innovations introduced at the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth, and that is reformulated with tremendous force and urgency in Artaud's polemical writings in the 1930s. Of course, it's also a question that's formulated with urgency and imagination in a number of the experiments in opera that we are gathered to consider at this symposium. As we do so, my hope is that we'll keep in mind yesterday's experiments, like Zimmermann's, as we explore those of today and tomorrow. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David, for a talk that that brings together so many of the things we've been talking about and recasts them in lots of different ways as well. Comments, questions? Yeah, right in the back.
I think you really interesting I'm wondering if you can comment on this, the Salzburg Festival that you showed here.
Yes.
I'm assuming the audience was just separated from the stage, right?
Correct.
Can you comment on the, I think 2008 performance of This Lesson in the Armory?
Yeah.
Where it had, I think it was on like a strip, right? And it had this.
Right. I can't comment on it. You know, there was a DVD that was withdrawn from circulation, which I've been unable. I'm sorry. For commercial legal reasons, I don't know. The David Poundy production. I've got visual documentation of it, but I didn't go. So I'd love to hear from all of you guys.
We were all on a platform that moved back and forth, and there was a kind of a long strip, basically like a T, where all the music was taking, or all the stage stuff was taking place, and you would move kind of closer and further away. It was very, very horrific, like very violent and sexual.
Got it. But spatially, it sounds like it was trying to play
more,
with.
I think, than this, where it was trying to do something with the actual relationship.
Right. And look, I mean, it seems to me like time is moving faster now, which is to say, it seems eminently possible to envision a production that would at least attempt, beyond merely situating speakers around the space, which is something that almost all of the productions do, that it would start to resituate its audience. And I mean, it seems to me like the Armory is one attempt, and my guess is, this piece is now being performed. It's the 100th anniversary of Timmerman's birth. It's being performed all over the world. My expectation is that there will be productions that will undertake this. I mean, it's a massive piece and extraordinarily difficult to do. So I can understand also why, maybe, rebuilding the house or moving it a bit to the left, might be something that opera intendanten are hesitant to do, given that they have to move mountains to do the piece in the first place.
Armin.
I love the idea of replacing Brecht with Artaud and thinking about the trajectory of opera in the 20th century. My question is, I feel like, because we, as scholars and directors, are so sort of focused on Brecht, like we know very clearly how to talk about the politics of being anti-Wagnerian and what's at stake with that throughout the 20th century, right? So I'm just curious, like, what are the politics of being a hyper-Wagnerian, especially immediately after World War II? So, what's the stakes for Zimmermann or for us?
Right.
Just stating things.
Obviously, I think you've answered the question in posing it. Obviously, in a period immediately after World War II, where the politics of immersion are so utterly tainted, and Artaud's relationship to fascism is itself, tainted and a question. Nonetheless, it seems to me like there are obviously ways in which we have to think about the plurality and heterogeneity of modernist practices and contemporary practices that can't be forced down the sort of road of high modernism. So, I think we need some other explanatory models. As for their politics, we're going to have to figure that out. But surely we can't preclude that discussion because it's unsavory. It's like, well, I'm sorry it's unsavory. I'm sorry it's messy. I guess I would say, that having been said, I don't know that I would say that Zimmermann is hyper-Wagnerian. I would say that Zimmermann is, utterly reckless and extraordinarily voracious, and therefore willing to take from all comers. And, happy to feast at Wagner's table, but also happy to feast at, at a rigorous Schoenberg, sort of serialist and post-Schoenberg compositional table. He is all over the map in terms of his aesthetic proclivities. And so I guess I'd want to say, let's be sure to encompass in our thinking the full range of his interests, because I think it'll only give us a richer account of the piece.
Yeah, thank you. really great to hear more about Zimmermann because he's pretty neglected in English colleges. I wanted to do my dissertation with him, so I have some thoughts. I'm pretty sure that the Zukunft der Oper essay starts with a discussion of Wagner and the Gesamtkunstwerk. I think Emily Claude translated that one as well.
She did.
And then the other thing is that I think that's important to keep in mind with this is that there's a degree to which the way that he's writing about the dramaturgy is very much lined up with the kind of dramatic content of the opera itself. So he's like, his approach towards lens is to essentially like turn every character into a cog in this giant kind of machine. And so the rape of Marie and the way she becomes a prostitute is all meant to be a kind of indictment of society in which every character is kind of half guilty, half innocent. And then, you know, at the very end, you have this juxtaposition of she's like walking towards her father who doesn't recognize her after she's become a prostitute. And the original idea was that you would show tanks rolling on a projector as well as the atomic atom cloud in the final
mushroom cloud, yes.
Yeah.
With the soundtrack of marching. Boots.
Yeah. The interesting thing about so I guess at the premiere they did a traditional proscenium stage, and the way that they showed, it was very controversial because the way that they showed the atom cloud was actually they just turned the stage lights on the audience and blinded everyone, which no one liked, and also no one got that it was an atom cloud. So Zimmermann added a note into his score saying, don't try to replicate the effect of seeing an atomic cloud, instead just provide the image of the atomic. Yeah, that's just some stuff. Thank you.
One thing that I think is probably worth noting about the compositional process of this piece is that, you know, Zimmermann is, I mean, in that sense, I think Wagnerian, extraordinarily lucid and articulate about his intentions and his aspirations. So in this case, the programmatic writings are really illuminating. They're often contradictory, also like Wagner, and as such, you know, extraordinarily suggestive for this really distressing piece.
Okay, so first up, I just wanted to pick up quickly on the topic of immersion and post-war music theater, and just add that as you're presenting this, I thought a little bit as well about Peter Weiss and Luigi Nono's The Investigation, where for the, at least for the Urban Piscator's production in West Berlin, they did have speakers around the audience, and it is, I mean, the play has no mimetic representations of Auschwitz, but the sound itself, you hear gas, kind of, you hear screams, and in an audience survey, actually, most of the people who walked out said they walked out because the music was too loud and unbearable. It wasn't anything about the testimony on stage. So that would be an example of kind of immersion to the opposite political end, and maybe even in the tradition of epic theater rather than Wagner. But this is connected to my bigger question, which is if you can put the speakers around the theater in the 60s, can it still be the theater of cruelty if you do that today? And I was really interested in when you were speaking about the sort of tension of your genealogy and sort of reclaiming this work, but going through Artaud, who's so sort of fundamentally anti-work, right? And so I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned that all three of the productions or recordings that you had were radically different. What would you, if you were the dramaturg for the next production, I mean, how would you situate the audience to make it speak, maybe even more to Artaud than just people sitting but with speakers around? Or do you think that can work in itself?
Well, okay, so, I mean, look, I think this is a question for all of us, but it's also, I think, a very specific question. So I think it would depend, you know, where are we doing the piece, and like where geographically, like in what city, in what culture, at what moment, but then also like in what space, right? And I think we'd want to have a conversation about what space would be adequate to the extraordinary scenic but also sonic demands of this piece. Because look, So, Peter Konvichny just did a production of Die Soldaten, and for Act 4, which is the most hallucinogenic part of the piece, right? There are 4 scenes taking place at the same time. He invited the opera audience onto the stage. So the orchestra remains in the orchestra pit, the auditorium has been evacuated, everyone's on stage, and the question is now, okay, so now what? And I think at that point, he ran out of rehearsal time. Because it's like, wait, in fact, essentially nothing happened. I mean, and furthermore, what's so interesting about this experience then of being up on the stage is, like, okay, there are now, I don't know, 1,300 people on the stage, and it's an extraordinary experience of really not knowing where to look, or what to do, or where you're supposed to go, or where something is transpiring. Like, there was this real anxiety of like, wait, I've got a ticket. I want my seat. Like, I want my unimpeded sight line. I want my auditory sort of subjectivity back. I want my centered, sort of ratified position qua spectatorship and, being an auditor of this piece back. And I think that disorientation, while I recognize that it was, super cool to have that experience, it was also really annoying. It was like, it was Germany, so of course, like, all these, like, super tall blonde people were, like, right in front of me, and I was like, I can't see anything, like, all you guys are like, on the one hand, I get how it works in theory. As for the practice, I guess we'd have to work on it, right? Because I'm not really sure. One thing I will say is, I wonder whether the place of Die Soldaten isn't basically here. Like, basically, like, me, my headphones, and, like, I don't know, maybe like a boombastic screen, but like, and then I'm like in an urban, so I was like in an urban space, like a kind of diasporic experience of it, where that sense of a kind of agon between immersion and dispersion is properly at stake. And insofar as, we're all experiencing opera outside the opera house anyway, like, why not?
Just to follow up on what you just said, David, then. So, in terms of Zimmermann's own writing, what would complete immersion in the musical process, if the translation is
Yes,
faithful,
it is.
what would complete immersion in the musical process look like? Would it be you with your screen in the city? Or would it be the inclusion of the spectators in the actual production of the opera, right? And it's hard to imagine what that would look like, where there was a sort of co-performance happening,
Right.
Which is what immersion, for me, in the musical process, right, would have to require, no?
Yeah, I never thought I would see the day when, there's this mantra that comes out of Berlin theater studies, the physical co-presence of the spectator. And I've spent much of my adult life fighting this position, which I think sort of fetishizes the integrity of my spectatorship in the face of performance. But in fact, I think in this case, physical co-presence is, I think, properly at stake. I think you're absolutely right to say, like, in some sense, like, this would be immersion one step removed, which I think is one step closer to reality than anything that Zimmermann experienced in the theater. And it's one step closer, I think, to anything that he aspires to. But, like, ideally, I think Zimmermann would want to insist on physical co-presence, where, like, we are in this space and there is, the risk of performance is at stake. And if I do it like this, things are at stake, but not the performance itself. So I think the point is really good. It's really vexing that you make this observation, but I think it's a very good point.
I mean, he does describe the specific physical space that would look like that. Multiple stages arranged around you with different combinations of instruments, which is also what Ecclesiastica, Action, and Requiem do too.
Indeed, and in fact, in the first version that you write in the 1960 version of this piece, he originally imagines it for 12 stages, and he situates his spectators on swivel chairs, right? So it's 12 stages all around, right? This is textbook Artaud, right? And the spectator would simply sort of pick and choose. But, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there is this sense of input from all over, and it being, in some sense, such a surfeit of expression and representation that it would be dizzying and overwhelming.
So I think that's a good thing, good place to leave things for today. As we pivot into some of the more practice-based discussions we'll be having tomorrow. Also, just a reminder that we're screening a film, Die War as an Opera of the World, tonight at 8 in Deutsch Hall, followed by a discussion with Richard Sennett and Saskia Sassen.
And DOR will be there also.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, they'll be talking to him.
Great, okay. At Deutsch Hall, so that's at 8. So that just leaves me to thank David once again.
But who is, I think, I mean, I know, what you said, but my impression is that it's really it's like, it's like, and it's not like Uncle Sam wants you, like, come on in, it's like, it is the call of the show. Oh my God.
Good seeing you.